Hello and welcome to session 19 of the History of Healing, and this is the first part of the history of naturopathic medicine, or the first of two lectures that will cover naturopathic medicine. And so we'll start today with our session aims, as we always do, to trace the roots of naturopathy to historical precedents studied this semester, of which there are many, to examine the development of naturopathy as a whole medical system and philosophy in the U.S. and the parallel developments in Australia, and to study the major contributors to naturopathic thought and practice in the early profession. So we'll start off today's lecture in the second half of the 19th century, around 1850 in the U.S., and look at what medicine was at that time and what lifestyle was like at that time, and what society was like at that time, and take a little trip back through some of the history of medicine that we've learned this semester so that we can gather up the historical threads that were woven into the practice of naturopathy when the profession was established, and that was the creation of a brand new profession. So around 1850 in the United States, the telephone, the telegraph, and the light bulb had not been invented yet. There was massive immigration of the Irish to America that was ongoing due to the potato famine, and the Industrial Revolution was continuing to drive the economy. Urban living conditions and lifestyle of both the wealthy and the poor were very much tied up in the Industrial Revolution at that point in time. Only land-owning white men had the right to vote. Governments were only just starting to take a greater hand in public health through sanitation, food safety, and housing regulation. And as you can imagine, we've traveled from Europe and now we're in the United States, and the U.S. being a much younger country, the types of things like public health and sanitation were not as developed as they were where we came from in Europe, so that's running a bit behind. Darwin had yet to publish his theory on evolution, and Gregor Mendel had yet to develop his theories on heritability of traits. So these are things that we've touched on earlier in this semester, but we're going back to a time prior to when those had happened. Ether had only just started to become used as an anesthetic in surgery. Vitamins had yet to be discovered, and so we're going back again to before where we were in our last lecture as we were studying the development of nutrition science. The American Medical Association was a small, eclectic group of practitioners at that point in time, not just medical doctors or regular medical doctors, and medical treatments were still in the mainstream, following such methods like bloodletting and the use of mercury, and other harming treatments, as well as obviously some medical treatments that were useful and curative. So turning to some of the foundational historical threads of naturopathy in the mid-1800s, and we have some of those listed here on the slide. Herbalism had been in practice worldwide across every culture for millennia, obviously, at this time, and we've talked a lot about that this semester. With regard to diet, the world was, this was generally not in the purview of medicine in terms of the medical doctors had started to let go of prescription of diet as being a mainstay of their treatment, as we talked about in our last lecture. But we've also, at this point in time, see diets improving as the Industrial Revolution continued, and as the variety and amounts of food were greater, even for the poorer classes of people. And that aside from the potato famine, of course, at that point in time. The diseases that we saw at this time tended towards those that would cause wasting, such as tuberculosis, and the goal of diet at this point in time was, in the sick, would have been to try and put more weight onto them. And again, this is back in the mid-1850s. The hygiene that we've seen has a strong feature of Greco-Roman medicine, and then had been lost to medicine for many centuries, but we now see it pick back up in our study of the mid-18th century in the U.S. The Age of Enlightenment and hygienes, including things like exposure to fresh air and sunshine and rest, and this had all experienced a resurgence at this point in time. both in the US and in Europe. And with increased public health measures that had started around that time period, hygiene by the mid-1800s was basically understood as a basis for health. And hygiene, in the way I'm talking about it in that last bit, is about cleanliness, is understood as necessary to health. Hydrotherapy, also listed on the slide, was only just becoming known in the States as a health discipline. But we met Vincent Priesnitz and our Father Sebastian Kneipp in Germany a few lectures ago. And by the mid-1800s, these guys were widely known in Europe for the successful treatment of pretty much any illness using cold water. Sorry, that's a misspeak on my part. Father Kneipp was a little bit later in the 1800s, and Vincent Priesnitz was the earlier time period. And so this was the driver behind the migration of hydrotherapy to the U.S., because in Europe, the nature cure movement was really sort of all the rage in terms of health support and healing from even very serious illnesses. And that drove the migration to the U.S., which we'll see in a few minutes. Homeopathy as a medical practice was relatively newly established and was really gaining use and popularity. And Samuel Hahnemann had passed away at that point in time by the by the 1850s. But James Tyler Kent, who we'll meet in a little while, had yet to enter the scene in American homeopathy, and so because he was still a child, and so American homeopathy hadn't really experienced the insurgence that we had seen in Europe with homeopathy at that point. The physical and manual therapies that we know today were as yet unexplored in the U.S., and we'll focus a great deal more on that this week, as well as in our following week, next week. And then the mental and moral discipline of the time. Remember that the Victorian era morality was really in full swing in the mid-1850s, and that was true not only in Britain but also in the U.S. There were right ways of conducting oneself and wrong ways. Self-discipline and a hard work ethic were respected and were seen as one's duty. But in addition to this, there was the uniquely American phenomenon of evangelicalism that was really sparked in the second half of the 1800s. And that came from a combination of Puritanism and Presbyterianism, some of which had migrated from Europe. And that brought huge numbers of people into congregational churches of different denominations and carried a certain degree of rigidity with regard to personal behavior and thought patterns. And we will see this really reflected in the basis of naturopathy early on. So we'll see as we travel through this lecture today that many of the personalities that were involved in the development of American naturopathy were very pious men of their day, and some of them, and women, I should say, and some of the ideas they espoused would today be considered quite unacceptable or antagonistic or other sort of negative words, and even in some instances would be considered very offensive today. So it's worth keeping that in mind. So moving on to the early development of naturopathy and what came right before essentially the development of naturopathy in the U.S. So we have a development of the nature cure movement focused in Germany and Austria in this time. And back in sessions 15 and 16, as we covered European medicine history, we briefly touched on the roots of hydrotherapy in England and Germany. We traced it in England to John Floyer, an English physician in the late 1600s, and flowing on to Johann Hahn in Germany in the mid-1700s, and then on to Vincent Priesnitz, who I mentioned on the last slide, who was an Austrian peasant farmer who became renowned for treating large number of people and a really wide variety of illnesses using cold water. And it was he who first popularized the use of water treatment in Europe, such that it became more widely used by the middle of the 1800s. Rouse declared that that Priesnitz was the, sorry, I'm jumping ahead of myself. So water cure was what it was called at that time, and it was later called hydropathy, and then that evolved into the modern term hydrotherapy. And J.H. Rouse, who was living in the first half of the 19th century, he wrote The Water Cure Applied to Every Known Disease. And he declared that Priesnitz was the discoverer of hydrotherapy, but not its master and finisher. And Rouse further developed the method by adjusting treatments to the needs and the tolerances of individual patients instead of treating everybody the same. He recognized that Priesnitz's methods were too harsh for some people who had been weakened by illness. And from him we see Johann Schroth coming just slightly later, or being his contemporary, and he added dry fasting and sweat baths to water treatment. And dry fasting is fasting from both food and water, and having sweat baths as an adjunct to water treatment. So these are the European seeds of naturopathy, and we find the genesis of naturopathy thus firmly seated really in Germany. And from this we move on to the grandfather of naturopathy, Father Sebastian Kneipp. And he lived in, for the breadth of the 19th century, all the way right up to the end. And he became a Catholic priest in 1852 in Bavaria, in Germany. And he began treating parishioners with water and herbal therapies with very great success. He was a Bavarian who was from a poor family, and he was originally rejected when he applied to enter the priesthood because he had tuberculosis. And that motivated him to cure his illness, and he took up treating himself using the water therapy methods that had been developed by Vincent Priesnitz and his followers after that, plus incorporating dietary changes, and he cured himself of tuberculosis, and from there he was allowed to enter the priesthood. So his book, which is called My Water Cure, helped him to rise to international prominence for the effectiveness of his treatments, along with his pure reputation for being able to heal people from some very, very serious illnesses. And as I mentioned, he's known as the grandfather of naturopathy. So his book, My Water Cure, has been through many editions and translations, and it's still available today. I have it in a glossy color paperback version that was published just a few years ago, and it is on the inside of it. It is a copy, a Xerox copy of the original print. And so in that book, he details his water and herb treatments, as well as daily practices that lay people, the average person, can do to promote and maintain health. And he was the most influential water curist after Priesnitz, and he was similarly internationally known, though his methods were gentler and more moderate. He was much more into this sort of middle road, all things in moderation kind of perspective. He still made abundant use of cold water, though, and his herbalism was a continuation of the traditions of monastic medicine that we discussed earlier this semester in our European medical history. At one stage, the regular doctors rose up against him and tried to get the government to stop him from treating people because he was not medically trained. But the church defended him, saying that it was a priest's purview to tend his parishioners in body as well as in spirit, and they won. So Father Kneipp continued treating patients until his death at the end of the 19th century. Water therapy in the Kneipp tradition is still practiced widely in Germany today. You can visit Bad Wurshofen, the town where Father Kneipp lived and practiced, and where there are many of what are called cure hotels. That's spelled K-U-R hotel, where you can take water treatments on a daily basis still in this day and age. There's a Kneipp school there which trains hydrotherapists in the modern sense, and the entire town is organized around Father Kneipp's 5 pillars of health, which are water, plants, meaning herbs, movement, diet, and balance, and particularly balance in spirit. And so, and also mental habits. And so we see here crystallized the precursor of naturopathic philosophy and theory. Our tutorial today is going to feature a photo tour of that modern day town. And I was visiting there earlier this year and got some photos of that. And the German government health system pays for citizens to spend time as needed for health in the medical spa towns such as these in Germany, as this is considered a necessity for maintaining health. And this is a form of therapy that's widely accepted in Germany for health maintenance and recovery of illness up to this day. So in terms of the continuity of history of naturopathy, it is perhaps best captured in Germany, even though the term naturopathy is not generally used there. So on to Benedict Lust, who was a student and patient of Father Kneipp. He lived from 1872 to 1945, and he was born in Germany. And like Father Kneipp, he contracted tuberculosis in his youth, and he went to Father Kneipp, who cured his tuberculosis with water treatments and herbs. And in 1892, Father Kneipp commissioned Benedict Lust to introduce the Kneipp water cure to the U.S. So he basically sort of sent him to the U.S. as a missionary of the water cure. And Lust is considered the father of naturopathy, though many other also influenced the development of the profession through the early days in the U.S. And the regular medical doctors of this time in the U.S. labeled Benedict Lust as the greatest menace to official medicine, a label that most nature cure doctors of the time would likely have been happy to wear. So we'll come back to Lust and his role in the development of naturopathy as a profession in the late 1800s in a bit. But for now, we're going to return to looking at hydrotherapy and how it influenced the development of naturopathy as a profession. So hydrotherapy in the U.S. was originally introduced prior to Benedict Lust coming. It was introduced in 1843 in New York, and it's quickly spread across the country. There were many American water curists that were regular medical doctors, and the theories and methods became more sophisticated over time. It's worth noting that this type of hydrotherapy that we're talking about, it's not for relaxation and is not frivolous in nature. It's an almost, you would almost want to call it a surgical application of cold water in very directed ways to very directed parts of the body in order to influence blood flow and the function of the nervous system in particular, nervous system and cardiovascular system. And you can see from the photo here or from the image on the slide, this woman is likely taking a treatment that has something to do with her menses or something else going on in her pelvic area, as the cold water is actually directed to the pelvic area. So the hydrotherapy in the U.S. at this time wasn't strictly in Father Kneipp's style, but it was very, very popular. And the first hydropathy center was opened in New York City in 1843, and the second one opened a year later. There had been a handful of hydropaths in the U.S. They were mostly trained by Priesnitz earlier in the century as well. And over the course of the next 50 years in the U.S., 200 centers opened across the country. Most of these were disillusioned regular medical doctors who wanted to provide a system of therapy that would be safer and more effective than regular medicine at that time. And the majority of the centers were in rural areas, and they were typically advertised as verdant hills and beautiful scenery, lots of exposure to nature. And so this really was the equivalent of what the nature cure movement was in Europe, happening through the 19th century. The typical hydropathy centers were big. They supplemented their treatments with entertainment like musical evenings and recitals. The cost was usually prohibitive to all but the wealthy and the upper middle class at that time. And the innovations that there were in practice that were accompanied by innovation in theory as well. So more than the peasant theories that were perpetuated by Priesnitz, these therapists were identifying a number of different impurities that could be in the body and how those impurities could be removed. And even mental activity was presumed to release products, toxic products into the body if they were negative thoughts, and thinking about how such impurities could be washed away from the system. And so hydrotherapy became entwined with the American hygiene movement at that point in time, and we'll talk about that again shortly. So hygiene and hydrotherapy, as they combined in the U.S., again took another step towards the establishment of naturopathy in the U.S., starting with Sylvester Graham. And if you've ever heard of graham crackers, I know that they aren't generally found in Australia, but if you've ever heard of graham flour or graham crackers, this is the man who they are named after. And he started the Grahamite health reform movement that was happening in the early to mid 1800s in the U.S. Russell Thatcher Trawl was another personality around this time, and he created a combination of hygiene and hydrotherapy that was called hygiotherapy. And John Harvey Kellogg, Kellogg is another name that will probably be familiar to you, and he is there in the image on the slide. He's the namesake of Kellogg's cereals today and historically. And he wrote a book, Rational Hydrotherapy. He had a sanatorium in Battle Creek, Michigan. And he came along a little bit later into the second half of the 18th century as the hygiene and hydrotherapy movements were progressing in the U.S. and as those larger centers that I was mentioning on the last slide came into being. So again, when we talk about hygiene in this lecture, we're not talking just about external bodily cleanliness, but we're talking about a system of health maintenance that addresses all the necessities of bodily upkeep and reduction of impurities in the body today, including what we might call today detoxification. And essentially, it's a term that refers, especially at this point in time in the U.S., to observing the natural laws and the functions of the body, mind, and emotions, and striving for purity as a method for maintaining health. So the theories of hygiene that were purported by Sylvester Graham fit really well with hydrotherapy at the time, and his view of purity of life, habits, and diet were adopted as part of the hydropath's treatments. And when Russell Trawl then expanded on that with his hygiotherapy, he was not really of the mind that cold water alone was the cure for everything. Thank goodness. So his system was one of multiple different therapeutics, and his system perhaps looked more about what we might call naturopathy today, or it was evolving further in that direction, and it gets closer to anything that we've seen so far this semester. So hygiotherapy was holism and holistic treatment before that word was even known and before that term was ever used. And the process required that the practitioner to obtain as much information from the patient as possible, and significant to the process was the notion that the state of mind affected the state of the health. So we're coming now into this concept of body, mind, spirit being seen in the evolution of medicine in going parallel to regular medicine in the U.S. And so this system actually required the intimate attention of the practitioner from the consultation through to the treatment. And treatments included medicines like herbs, minerals, etc., electrical treatments, Swedish movement, gymnastics, or what we might call calisthenics or exercise today, diet, and water treatments. And he established a college in his name in the late 1850s in New York. John Harvey Kellogg was quite a character, and he was a doctor, a regular medical doctor originally, and a hydrotherapist who brought a form of scientific German hydrotherapy to the U.S. and wrote a definitive American textbook on hydrotherapy, which is noted there, Rational Hydrotherapy. And he further studied with Troll in the U.S. and his range of therapeutic were quite similar to Troll's, but then expanded on them further. He became then very focused on the concept of self-intoxication and how we might have internally generated toxins within the body, particularly in the colon, and his treatments started to focus very almost exclusively on what we could do by maintaining the cleanliness and the health and the robustness of the movement of the colon. And so this is probably one of the reasons that he has sort of had fun poked at him from the historical perspective or looking back on that, because he might have been one of the original, he wasn't a naturopath per se because the term didn't exist then, but he would have been one of the first people who really took up in the Western setting the focus that modern naturopaths have on the movement of the bowels and the health of the bowels and what's going on in the digestion. It's worth noting that he was a prominent member of the Church of Seventh-day Adventists. So this is what I was mentioning in terms of the influence of the different religions and spiritualities of the time in the U.S. And that was up until his midlife. And that really most certainly influenced his medical practice as well. Seventh-day Adventists believe in a vegetarian diet, in abstinence from alcohol and tobacco, and those were certainly mainstays of his treatment, along with a regimen of exercise. And the Seventh-day Adventists have a very long history in the U.S. of connection to natural medicine and maintaining a separation from conventional medicine. So another interesting thing to note was how women were interfacing with the hydrotherapy and hygiene at this time. There were several influential female practitioners and writers in the field, and this was at a time when women were not generally involved in medicine other than nursing. And at some water cure centers, 2/3 of the patients were female, despite this being an era when women were actually discouraged from travel, and these centers were located in rural areas. So the draw of women to hydrotherapy and hygiene is thought to be due to the atmosphere at these particular centers as being open in terms of sharing information about female health concerns, and that was not generally seen in other settings of medicine at this time. Also, for the fact that the water treatments were effective for their concerns, perhaps in a different way than what else was available at that time. And you'll note from the image from the prior slide of the woman receiving a very directed, most likely female-focused hydrotherapy treatment. Oh, we have effects here. So going on historically through other influences that there were coming out of Europe at this time, Arnold Rickley was a Swiss person focused on the pioneering of naturism, swimming in cold water, sunbathing, walking, spending time naked out in nature. Louis Kuhn was a German who was focused on the eliminations of toxins, and he used cold water treatments that focused on the lower abdomen and the pelvis, with accompanying friction rubbing to stimulate the colon and the excretory organs to eliminate toxins and to promote vegetarianism as well. F.E. Bills was also a well-known German who wrote The Natural Healing Method, and this was a nature cure classic from that nature cure movement in Europe. And Adolf Just, a German who wrote Return to Nature, he was the founder of the Jungborn Institute in New York. So the doctors who were proceeding in the nature cure and hydrotherapy vein in both the U.S. and Germany and other parts of Europe as well were developing therapies that really focused on diet, oftentimes vegetarianism or fasting, exposure to sunshine and fresh air, water therapies with cold water, and that's both ingested, drinking cold water and applying it to the outside of the body, stimulation of the elimination of toxins through the appropriate excretion routes, the natural routes that the body has, as opposed to by bloodletting. And purity of habits and thoughts. But we really have yet to see this consolidated into a single profession with a single name. It was really more of a movement at the time, and it was a movement that oftentimes was involving regular medical doctors who were taking a sidestep out of conventional medical practice and seeking out other opportunities for their patients and other types of treatments. There were then a couple of other major therapeutic threads to feed into the collective before we actually got the formation of naturopathy. So we have American herbalism, that being a somewhat unique developmental trajectory of herbalism, and so we'll spend a little bit of time on this. And Samuel Thompson is probably the best known early American herbalist. Again, we're bumping right up against the mid 1800s with the end of his life, and he lived in New England. He was a self-taught botanist and herbalist, self-taught versus via personal experimentation with herbs, and also spending time with local herbalist women. So these would have been women who had brought European medical traditions and perhaps found the same plants or similar plants in the U.S. that were having similar therapeutic effects. These might have been local women who had had exposure to the Native American herbal lore and learning from the Native Americans what types of native plants were used medicinally. There also might have been the migration of plants or seeds from Europe and being put into the pharmacopoeia in American nature. So the actual migration of the plants themselves. And so we have obviously a rich lore to call on, a lot of different sources to call on for this information. He was convinced by personal experimentation of the medicinal virtues of herbs and the dangers of conventional medicine coming from the late 1700s, early on in his development. And so herbalism at this point in time was obviously a well-established treatment modality in folk medicine and also in mainstream medical practice coming into the 1800s. But the use of herbs by regular doctors was often accompanied by toxic metals as well. And oftentimes herbs were used in a very aggressive way in terms of creating purgation and emesis, vomiting. And diarrhea in order to drain the humors, because we're still working in the system of the four humors in regular medicine at this point in time in the U.S. We can look partly to European herbalism and particularly to Father Kneipp as well with regard to the inclusion of herbalism within the discipline of naturopathy. But herbal medicine in America really has very diverse roots, as I was mentioning. And so with American herbalism developing alongside or coming up kind of parallel to the developments I was talking about in hygiene and hydrotherapy earlier, you have these systems just sort of almost waiting to merge together like they had been merged together in Europe. It's an interesting story to tell the story of Samuel Thompson and his escapades with the herb Lobelia inflata. He knew that from his own personal experimentation to be a powerful emetic, something that induces vomiting in higher doses, and he understood the medicinal effects that it has also in lower doses, and he delighted in offering the plant to his young friends to eat and watching how they would immediately turn deathly pale and have a wave of nausea washing over them before they emptied the contents of their stomach. And so he was a bit of a trickster when he was younger, but that was his mode of early experimentation. Even if it wasn't very kind. So he used this plant as a practical joke, almost without realizing its medical virtue when he was younger. From that point in time moving forward, though, that type of experimentation, particularly with himself, really helped him develop his herbalism. And he had an early injury, as oftentimes these healers have, and as oftentimes healers have now. There was an early injury or illness that sparked his interest in actually turning to the medicinal use of plants. And he had an early injury of his ankle with an axe, and a physician actually recommended amputation of his foot. And rather than have his foot removed, he actually sought to build a poultice out of comfrey, which actually cured the injury to the ankle. And Samuel wrote with regard to this, the principal cause of taking up the practice of medicine was this injury to his ankle, which was cured by a herb, in his view. So Thomsonian medicine is based on two premises, and that is that the body has a central heater, which is the stomach, and the stomach can be blocked by mucus that forms in it. And so an emetic can be used to clear the mucus, and then heat is restored by applying external heat or ingesting hot herbs into the stomach. And again, there's background to this as well. Soon after the death of his mother, Samuel actually developed a cough himself, and rather than submitting to orthodox treatments, he chose to treat himself. And the results were very dramatic, and he was restored. And so his faith in herbal medicines was really sealed at that point in time. And as we go into the discussion of his herbal medicine system, please remember that the four humors, again, are still alive and well in regular medical practice at this time, and the bleeding and purging and emesis were very widely used. And so his use of emesis and using herbs for purposes of encouraging purgation and vomiting was not an unusual thing at this point. So the combination of the treatments as listed on the slide was expected to restore the vital heat of the body and to produce a cure through stimulating the digestion. And again, here the treatment is about stimulating the patient's innate vitality, the internal heat. And this was based on the results of his clinical testing, and the science of his clinical testing was probably what we would consider dubious at best. The image here on the slide is his favorite emetic, which I mentioned on the prior slide, Lobelia inflata. And he further developed his system to include many other herbs and other herbal actions, including gentler herbs meant to be more restorative after the heat had been unblocked in the stomach. And he used stimulating herbs such as bitters in order to encourage gastrointestinal tract function. His system of medicine developed into a system that was about every man being his own physician, and every woman as well. It was a popular medicine with a view that anyone could heal themselves using his system, and he patented his system in 1813. He then mailed remedies out across the country to anyone who ordered them, and those came with instructions about how to use his system. And this was seen as safer than regular medicine of the day. There were local botanical societies that developed around his system of medicine, and those that were using his remedies would come together locally in groups and discuss different ideas and different treatments. So this was a very self-empowering system of medicine that he developed. But the system of medicine collapsed upon his death. The regular doctors had attacked him based on his lack of formal education, and herbs were seen as being too complex to be administered to lay people by themselves. So the system that followed in development after his death then addressed those concerns. And that system was called physiomedicalism. So this was a short-lived medical ideology between Thomsonianism and the year of 1911, and it used a system of cure according to universal truths of nature, the vital force of the human organism. And it had a very strong following, even though it was relatively short-lived. And it was used by skilled and medically trained practitioners instead of being something that would empower the patient to heal themselves. So Alva Curtis, who had been originally the editor of the Thomsonian Recorder, he was the one who started the Independent Botanic Society in the U.S., and he founded the Physiomedical College originally in Ohio. The physiomedicalists thought that the view of eclectics, who we will meet in a minute, and the homeopaths, who also were in existence around at that time, were too narrow. And so they felt that a continued development of regular or laboratory medicine was useless at the bedside. And they had kind of a point there. And they also felt that these other systems lacked a coherent theory and philosophy. So they felt the eclectics lacked this coherent philosophy, and their other complaint was against the regular doctors, and that was that they had become completely mechanistic and really were ignoring the vital nature of the human organism. So out of all that critique of everything that was going on around them, they developed another system of medicine, essentially. And the definition of physiomedicalism is a medical philosophy founded on the theorem of a vital force or energy inherent in living matter of tissue units, whose aggregate expression in health and disease is the functional activities of the organism, and whose inherent tendency is integrative and constructive, resistive, eliminative, and reconstructive to inimical invasion or disease causations. So this was a pretty complex thought. That was a quote from J.M. Thurston, a medical doctor, in his book on physiomedicalism. And another quote here: "No one well acquainted with the subject of medicine will attempt to deny that instead of medical science today, we are only in the cumulative stage, and while pregnant with brilliant discoveries of great principles and abstract facts in every department of specialized lines, it must be admitted by all candid minds that this great mass of experimental medical facts is practically in a chaotic state, giving rise to conflicting opinions, theories, and dogmas, because, as we contend, of a failure to establish a working hypothesis." So this is, again, a critique of not having a central philosophy of medicine. And sort of chasing around after different theories that was all being done in a relatively chaotic way. And the physiomedicalists were trying to pull that together. So they were generally trained medical doctors, but they didn't class themselves as regular medical doctors. And the practice died out because it was overcome by the need for more scientific approach as germ theory gained ground. And again, hearkening back to our discussion of germ theory development a couple of weeks ago. So the image here on the slide is from a book on physiomedicalism in 1900, and you can see how far science has come at this stage because we have pictorial portrayals of cells of different types on the slide, as well as the understanding of the cell as having a nucleus and being different types of cells in different types of tissues. So now we talk about the eclectics, and the eclectics might be the most well-known of all of the disparate schools of medical thought that predated naturopathy and actually existed as naturopathy was developing and afterwards as well. So this was an American school of medicine that began in the early 19th century. The key figure in the eclectic school was a man named Worcester Beach, and its practice became similar to physiomedicalism, and both of those medical systems were very foundational in the early development of the discipline of naturopathy. So the eclectic school drew on all schools of alternative medicine, but especially herbal medicine, and a focus on Native American herbs. And their perspective was use anything that works. And I would say that that perspective really persisted up into modern naturopathy. I know that Dr. John Bastyr, who is the namesake of the school that I taught at, very much carried this as part of his philosophy. If it works, use it, as long as it's not harmful. So through the 19th century, there were about 20 eclectic medical schools in America. Those were mostly in the Midwest, and the last one didn't close until 1939. The expansion of the eclectic school in the mid-1800s, which was similar to the Thomsonian school and the physiomedicalists, was fueled by an increasing popular distrust of regular medicine with the mercury and the bloodletting and the other harmful treatments. And it really peaked in the late 1800s, really just prior to naturopathy coming on the scene. So its philosophy was to treat the patient, not the disease, and that strengthening the patient's vital force was key. So you can see how this was very similar to naturopathy eventually. It developed over a century an extensive American herbal materia medica, and that materia medica is still consulted today. The eclectics were the most renowned organized system of herbalists in American medical history in terms of a consolidated group of herbalists. There was a volatile history of dispute that they were derided by the Orthodox school, and the eclectic school was stubbornly independent and really spurned regular medicine and its harmful treatments. So that's the end of part 1 of this lecture. Here are your revision questions, which are also on your LMS as usual. And your other food for thought: why might vegetarianism have been a focus of dietary therapy in the mid to late 1800s based on what we've learned this semester about the history of food? And I will leave you with that, and I will see you in part 2. Thank you for joining.